You are in Florence, in the year 1519. The air is heavy with the scent of dye and river water, of wet wool, and the slow burn of olive oil lamps. In the Medici household, a child is born, not into warmth and comfort, but into the fragile uncertainty of politics. Her name is Caterina Maria Romola di Lorenzo de' Medici, the last legitimate descendant of the Medici line. She will one day become Queen of France, but for now, she is only a child in a city that mistrusts her name. Catherine's birth came at a time when Florence was weary of its rulers. The Medici, wealthy bankers turned princes, had been expelled and restored so many times that the people no longer knew whether to hate them or simply endure them. Her father, Lorenzo II de' Medici, Duke of Urbino, was already sick with syphilis when she was born. Her mother, Madeleine de la Tour d'Auvergne, a French noblewoman, died of puerperal fever shortly after giving birth. Within weeks, Catherine was an orphan, a small, dark-haired infant left to the care of a dynasty that had grown as cold as its marble palaces. It is often said that Catherine's early years shaped her later caution. She was raised by distant relatives, and then by nuns, hidden in convents, while the Medici fortunes rose and fell. When the Republican forces of Florence revolted against the family in 1527, Catherine, only 8 years old, became a hostage. The rebels called her the daughter of the devil. They paraded her through the streets and confined her in a convent, threatening to send her to a brothel if her family did not surrender. Even then, she remained calm, reading Latin prayers and copying scripture. Her calmness, some said, was eerie. Others called it resolve. In truth, it was likely fear internalized and hidden, a habit that would never leave her. The rebellion eventually failed. The Medici returned, restored by the combined pressure of Pope Clement VII, her uncle, and the armies of Charles V. Catherine was brought back into the fold, her safety assured by the same men who saw her as a bargaining chip. She was 11 when the Pope decided her future. Florence had no throne for her, but Europe had many courts. A Medici girl, educated in French, Latin, and the art of diplomacy, could be a valuable bride. And so, the match was made. In 1533, Catherine was betrothed to Henry, Duke of Orleans, the second son of King Francis I of France. The marriage was not born of affection or politics of love, but of convenience, a union between papal ambition and French royal strategy. Francis I wanted papal favour for his war with Charles V. Clement VII wanted to secure his family's place among Europe's monarchies. Catherine was the price and the prize. The journey from Florence to Marseille, where the wedding would take place, was long and ceremonial. Catherine's trousseau was lavish brocades, jewels, Italian perfumes, and a dowry that dazzled the French court. But when she arrived, the whispers began immediately. She was not beautiful, the courtiers said. Too small, too Italian, too plain. They mocked her accent, her mannerisms, her dark eyes that seemed to watch everything and reveal nothing. The French preferred fair-haired women with easy laughter. Catherine, with her quiet composure and careful politeness, seemed foreign, both intriguing and unsettling. Her husband, Henry, was 15 and uninterested. His heart already belonged to another Diane de Poitiers, a woman nearly 20 years his senior, elegant, learned, and commanding. Catherine knew this from the first week of their marriage. Diane dressed the king's son, managed his correspondence, even chose his clothes. Catherine, in turn, smiled, curtsied, and learned to wait. The early years at court were humiliating. She bore no children for the first decade of her marriage, a dangerous failure for any queen in waiting. The courtiers whispered that she was barren, that the marriage was cursed, that perhaps the Medicis, rumoured to dabble in poison and sorcery, had brought misfortune upon France. Catherine prayed, She studied alchemy and medicine, consulted midwives, and performed strange rituals inherited from her Florentine upbringing. Whether through these efforts or by chance, in 1544, she finally gave birth to a son, Francis, the future Francis II of France. In the years that followed, she would bear 9 more children, 7 of whom survived infancy. Through these trials, she learned patience. She learned, too, the delicate craft of invisibility, how to listen without speaking, to observe without appearing to notice. While Henry devoted himself to Diane and to military campaigns, Catherine filled her time with architecture and gardens, commissioning the Château de Chenonceau and the Tuileries Palace. She studied astrology and chemistry, invited Italian artisans and scholars to France, and maintained her dignity through silence. The French court of the 1542 was a place of ceremony and hierarchy, where alliances were whispered over chessboards and betrayals hidden behind silk veils. Catherine moved through it like a shadow, never commanding the room, but never leaving it either. When King Francis I died in 1547, Henry became Henry II, and Catherine became queen, though only in title. Real influence still belonged to Diane de Poitiers. It is tempting to imagine Catherine resenting this woman. Yet, the historical record suggests something more complex. She did not challenge Diane openly. She even deferred to her, allowing Diane to wear the crown jewels and to manage royal affairs. But behind the apparent submission was a cold, strategic patience, the same endurance that had preserved her through childhood exile and courtly ridicule. Catherine understood that power, like poison, worked best when slow and invisible. The court of Henry II was divided between factions: Catholics loyal to Diane and reformists watching the rise of Protestantism across France. Catherine, raised amid Italy's volatile politics, recognized the danger. France was no longer unified by faith or by loyalty. Its noble families, the Guises, Bourbons, and Montmorencys, were already maneuvering for dominance. Catherine's children, the heirs of France, would inherit a nation divided by doctrine and ambition. When Henry II was accidentally killed in a jousting tournament in 1559, a splintered lance through the eye, a wound both grotesque and symbolic, everything changed. Diane was exiled. Catherine, now Queen Mother and Regent, stepped into a void of power that had been waiting for her since birth. But before the calm of her regency, there had been years of silent endurance, years in which Catherine absorbed lessons from every humiliation and slight. Her household mirrored her own temperament: quiet, efficient, faintly eerie. She maintained Italian cooks and apothecaries, and her fascination with astrology never waned. She hosted the magician Cosimo Ruggieri, who built a black mirror said to reveal the future. Her court dinners often included exotic dishes, spices, and perfumes that unsettled the French palate. To some, these foreign affectations were signs of refinement. To others, they were omens, reminders of the whispers that would later make her infamous. The notion that Catherine de' Medici was not merely a queen, but a poisoner. These rumors began quietly. A courtier who died suddenly, a rival who fell ill after dinner, the presence of small glass vials in her chambers, the Italian apothecaries who followed her everywhere. In an age when women were seldom credited with political acumen, poison became the language through which power was explained, particularly female power. To the French, it seemed easier to believe that Catherine ruled through potions and death than through patience and intelligence. Still, her influence grew. When her husband died and her eldest son, Francis II, ascended the throne, Catherine became the power behind the child king. She managed his council, negotiated between warring factions, and sought to keep France intact. But Francis's reign was short, ending with his death in 1560 at the age of 16. Catherine's second son, Charles IX, then became king. He was only 10. And so Catherine ruled again, officially as regent, unofficially as the silent heart of French politics. The widow from Florence, once dismissed as barren and irrelevant, was now the most powerful woman in France. It is here that the story of Catherine de' Medici begins to shift from quiet endurance to active control, a transformation that would give rise to her most enduring legend, that of the Poison Queen. But before the shadows of conspiracy and massacre, there was still a mother's calculation, a widow's survival, and a ruler's impossible task to keep France from tearing itself apart. Yet, one cannot help but wonder, in a court where dinner could decide a dynasty, where perfume might conceal venom, and where prophecy was consulted more often than policy, how much of Catherine's power came from her own will, and how much from the fear she inspired? And, perhaps more importantly, when did the careful, patient girl from Florence decide that survival alone was not enough? You are in the Louvre in the winter of 1560. The palace is cold, its great halls lined with tapestries meant to muffle the draught, but not the whispers. France has a new monarch, a boy king, Charles IX, 10 years old. His mother, Catherine de' Medici, stands beside the throne, dressed in mourning black. Around her, the noble factions circle like wolves, waiting to see who will lead the feast. The death of her eldest son, Francis II, the year before, had almost destroyed her position. The Guise family, powerful Catholic nobles related to the late king's wife, Mary, Queen of Scots, had dominated his brief reign. Now, with Francis gone and the boy Charles too young to rule, Catherine was named regent. For the first time in her life, she had undisputed authority, but only as long as she could keep the balance between France's warring lords. Outside the palace, the country was fracturing. The Reformation had spread across Europe, and France was divided between Catholics and Protestants, or Huguenots, as the French reformers were called. Towns burned churches, mobs tore down statues, and the countryside echoed with sermons and violence. For a queen who had survived the chaos of Italian politics, the religious wars were both familiar and dreadful. Catherine's instinct was not zeal but balance. She wanted peace not from idealism, but from the clear-eyed understanding that civil war would destroy the monarchy itself. Catherine's first act as regent was to call for moderation. She summoned the Estates General and invited both Catholic and Protestant leaders to the Colloquy of Poissy, a meeting meant to find common ground between the two faiths. It was an extraordinary gesture, almost unthinkable for the time, a royal mother proposing dialogue instead of execution. The conference failed, of course. Theology seldom bends to politics, but the attempt showed something important about her rule. She would govern not by conviction, but by calculation. Her court became a theatre of subtle gestures. Each meal, each audience, each choice of clothing was a message. She often wore black, the colour of mourning, but also of authority, simplicity, and mystery. She received ambassadors in chambers scented with incense and arranged her council so that no faction could dominate. She kept her children close, her daughters as pawns for marriage alliances, her sons as symbols of legitimacy. And behind her, always, were the Italian advisors and astrologers who made the French uneasy. Her most trusted was Cosimo Ruggieri, the Florentine magician. He built an observatory on the roof of the Tuileries, where he and Catherine studied the stars. According to legend, he constructed a mirror that could reveal the faces of the dead, and Catherine, unable to resist, gazed into it to see her sons' futures. One by one, their faces appeared and vanished, and none, it was said, lived to old age. Whether the story was true or an invention of her enemies hardly mattered. The French loved their rumours, and Catherine's fascination with astrology, coupled with her Italian household of perfumers, doctors, and cooks, was enough to make her the subject of endless suspicion. In reality, her power lay not in sorcery, but in patience and precision. She cultivated informants in every noble household. Letters were intercepted, alliances mapped, betrayals quietly anticipated. She rarely raised her voice, but she never forgot an insult or a promise. Her intelligence network rivaled that of any modern state, a web of servants, secretaries, and courtiers, all quietly feeding her information. In the middle of this intricate machinery, Catherine ruled as if she were balancing a scale that could never rest. But balance, in France, was a dangerous illusion. The year 1562 brought the first of the wars of religion. It began, as wars often do, with a single spark: the massacre of Vassy, where soldiers of the Duke of Guise attacked a group of Protestant worshippers. Dozens were killed. In the aftermath, Protestant leaders, including Admiral Gaspard de Coligny, raised armies against the crown. Civil war swept across France. Catherine tried to mediate. She negotiated truces, issued edicts of limited tolerance, and moved her children from city to city to keep them safe. But peace never lasted. Each treaty was broken by one side or the other. Each massacre begot revenge. To survive, Catherine began to rely less on persuasion and more on manipulation. At court, she played the factions against each other. She would dine with the Catholic Guises one evening and confer privately with the Protestant Condé the next. She promised both sides what they wanted, though she knew she could deliver neither. Her letters from this time are full of cautious phrasing. "I shall do what is necessary. We must be guided by prudence, all things in their time." To her, politics was a kind of chess, no move final, no peace indispensable, only the preservation of the king essential. It was also during this period that her reputation as a poisoner deepened. There was the case of Jeanne d'Albret, Queen of Navarre, a Protestant leader and mother of the future King Henry IV. When Jeanne died suddenly in 1572, just before her son's marriage to Catherine's daughter, rumours spread that she had been poisoned by a pair of perfumed gloves sent from the Queen Mother. Modern historians find no evidence for this. Yet the story persisted, because it fit the pattern the French imagined. A woman who ruled through deceit and chemistry, not armies or crowns. Catherine understood these whispers, but did nothing to dispel them. In a sense, they served her. Fear was a kind of armor. No one dared confront her directly. Even her enemies, those fierce Protestant nobles, treated her with a strange, wary respect. She used this reputation as a tool, the way an alchemist uses mercury, knowing it is both poison and cure. Her court, meanwhile, became a study in controlled decadence. The Ballet Comique de la Reine, the first court ballet, was performed under her patronage, blending dance, myth, and moral allegory. She brought Italian chefs and perfumers, established new fashions, and built elaborate gardens. The air at court was heavy with the scent of musk and orange blossom, and every colour, every emblem carried meaning. The black and white interlaced crescents she wore were both a tribute to her late husband and a symbol of her enduring presence. She could not be loved, so she ensured she would be remembered. But beyond the elegance and ritual, the country bled. The wars continued, with brief interludes of peace. Each of her sons, Francis II, Charles IX, and later Henry III, grew into kings under her shadow. Each inherited a throne weaker than the last. Catherine's power was not the authority of command, but the fragile dominance of someone who could see further ahead than anyone else, yet lacked the means to change what she saw coming. In 1570, after years of bloodshed, Catherine sought to end the conflict through marriage. Her daughter, Marguerite de Valois, known to history as Queen Margot, was to marry Henry of Navarre, the Protestant heir of Jeanne d'Albret. The union was meant to symbolize reconciliation between Catholics and Protestants. The wedding was held in Paris, in August 1572, the city filled with nobles from both sides, their swords hidden under their finery. For a moment, it seemed that Catherine's vision of balance might triumph. Then came the Street Bartholomew's Day massacre. The details remain debated, Who gave the order? Who struck first? What is certain is that, in the nights following the wedding, thousands of Protestants were killed in Paris and across France. The blood flowed into the Seine. The bells of Saint-Germain-l'Auxerrois tolled through the dark. Some said Catherine had planned it, that she had invited her enemies to the city only to destroy them. Others claimed she had lost control of the situation, that the violence began as an attempt to assassinate Admiral Coligny and spiraled beyond anyone's intent. Catherine never confessed, nor did she deny. She simply continued to govern, her composure unbroken, her letters carefully phrased. What is done cannot be undone. We must now preserve what remains. It is easy, centuries later, to see her as a villain, the calculating queen who traded lives for power. Yet in her own mind, she was a guardian of the state, defending the monarchy against disintegration. She had lived too long in the panned company of uncertainty to believe in purity or justice. She believed only in necessity. As her second son, Charles IX, grew older, he began to resent her influence. He was haunted by guilt over the massacre, convinced that his mother had led him into sin. His health declined, his mind with it. Catherine, ever the pragmatist, turned her attention to her next son, Henry, who would become Henry III. Even as Charles lay dying, she managed the transition with clinical precision, ensuring that the crown would remain in Valois hands. By the time Henry III ascended the throne in 1574, Catherine was no longer the quiet Florentine bride or the cautious regent. She was the architect of survival, a woman whose rule had outlasted popes, princes, and husbands. Yet her legacy was poisoned by the same suspicion that had once protected her. She had preserved the monarchy, but at the cost of its soul. Still, Catherine continued to rule from the shadows, her influence undiminished. Ambassadors described her as tireless, riding across France even in her 60s to negotiate peace, inspect troops, and arrange marriages. She worked until her body failed her, still believing that one more treaty, one more calculated concession, might hold the kingdom together. But perhaps the deeper question is not how Catherine ruled, but why she believed she must. Was it love for her sons, or fear of irrelevance? Was her obsession with control born of ambition, or the lingering terror of a childhood spent as a hostage? In the end, the shadow court she built around herself reflected her own soul, disciplined, opaque, and haunted by its own success. And yet, as she grew older, one question must have followed her, quietly, like the scent of her Italian perfumes. After so many years of survival, had Catherine de' Medici truly secured France, or had she only delayed its collapse? It is the late 1570 seconds in France. The air smells faintly of wood smoke and damp parchment. Catherine de' Medici is no longer young. Her black gowns are heavier now, her steps slower, but her schedule remains relentless. She rises before dawn, dictates letters, receives ambassadors, and rides through muddy roads in carriages padded with straw to cushion her aching joints. She has lived through 5 papacies, 3 French kings, and nearly half a century of suspicion. France is weary, divided, and suspicious of itself, yet still whole. That, Catherine would say, was her doing. Her son Henry III now wears the crown. Once the brilliant, charming Duke of Anjou, he had been her favourite, the one she believed most capable of restoring dignity to the throne. He returned from his brief election as King of Poland with exotic habits and restless melancholy. He preferred scented gloves, pearl earrings, and processions more ceremonial than practical. Catherine, who valued appearance as a tool, indulged him at first. But even she worried that pageantry without purpose was dangerous. A king must be loved or feared, she is said to have told him, but never merely watched. France under Henry III was fragile. The wars of religion had flared again. New factions emerged, the militant Catholic League, the Huguenot nobles, and the royalists who tried to stand between them. Catherine had spent her entire adulthood walking that narrow bridge between faiths. But now, the wood beneath her feet was cracking. Henry III, insecure and often ill, relied on his mother's counsel yet resented her shadow. Their correspondence is full of small courtesies, hiding deep irritation. She calls him mon fils bien-aimé, my beloved son, and ends with advice written in careful understatement. Do not allow zeal to undo reason. By then, Catherine had become almost an institution, the embodiment of the crown's endurance. Ambassadors compared her to marble, polished, cold, and immovable. They wrote of her unfailing attention to business and her great skill in disguising her mind. She negotiated personally with rebellious governors, travelled to meet Protestant leaders, and even arranged to face the formidable Henry of Navarre, her former son-in-law and future rival for the throne. The meeting between Catherine and Henry of Navarre in 1586, near the town of Saint-Brice, was a scene of weary pragmatism. She, nearly 70, arrived in a litter carried by 6 men. He, the energetic commander of the Huguenot armies, came on horseback. Mud splattered on his boots. They talked for hours. She urged compromise. He listened respectfully and declined. They parted with mutual courtesy, each understanding that France would bleed again. Even then, she believed conversation could heal what swords had torn. Perhaps she knew that her life had been a long attempt to civilize violence, with words an attempt destined to fail, yet necessary to keep trying. Back in Paris, Catherine's presence still commanded fear. The courtiers who whispered about her in their youth were now grey-haired men, but the rumours never aged. They said she carried poisons in diamond rings, that she kept a cabinet of Venetian glass bottles, labelled in Italian, pericolo, rapido, dolce, morte danger, swift, sweet death. They pointed to the deaths of her rivals and saw patterns. No one asked whether those deaths were simply the ordinary harvest of plague, age, and war. In an age when women could not rule openly, fear served as proof of power. Catherine, who had once survived by invisibility, now survived by myth. Her household still bore the marks of her Florentine heritage. The kitchens smelled of citrus and vinegar, the perfumes of Florence mingling with the French air. Her apothecaries ground powders and distilled essences for medicines. Not murder, yet the line between remedy and toxin was thin. Mercury for the skin, arsenic to bleach the face, laudanum for sleep. These were the fashionable tools of survival. Perhaps Catherine herself understood irony, that she was accused of poisoning others while slowly poisoning herself, as every court lady did, with the tinctures of her age. She had never truly been alone. Behind the scenes were her secretaries. Doctors. She corresponded with Bernard Palissy, the potter, about glazes and minerals, with Pierre de l'Estoile, the chronicler, about the behaviour of the court. Even in her 60s, she commissioned new buildings, the extension of the Tuileries, the decoration of Chenonceau. The gardens, she insisted, must be designed with geometric order. To shape stone and soil was her way of making permanence out of transience. Buildings, she once remarked, do not betray. Still, she could not build fast enough to contain the chaos beyond her walls. By 1588, France was on the verge of collapse again. The Catholic League, led by Henri, Duke of Guise, had seized Paris. The king fled the capital, humiliated. Catherine, exhausted but undeterred, followed him to Blois, urging negotiation. She understood the Guise threat. She had balanced their ambition for 30 years, but Henry III, desperate to assert control, ordered their assassination. When news of the murders reached Catherine, she is said to have sighed and whispered, then we are all lost. Her long career of cautious equilibrium had ended in a single act of rash violence she could not prevent. The following winter was bitterly cold. She fell ill at bronchitis, perhaps pneumonia. She continued to dictate letters, her handwriting shaky, her voice faint but steady. On the 5th of January 1589, Catherine de' Medici died in her chambers, aged 69. Her son was not beside her. He was preoccupied with securing his throne amid rebellion. She asked to be buried beside Henry II at Saint-Denis. Beneath the tomb they had commissioned years before, an effigy of husband and wife kneeling eternally in stone. Yet the wars prevented her funeral. Her body was left unburied for months, moved from place to place until order returned. It was a fitting end for a life spent in transit, always between factions, between faiths, between affection and fear. After her death, France descended once more into chaos. Henry III was assassinated later that same year. The throne passed, at last, to Henry of Navarre, now Henry IV, the first Bourbon king. He converted to Catholicism to claim the crown and brought an uneasy peace. Catherine's descendants ruled France for 2 centuries, though none bore the name Medici. Her influence, however, lingered in habits the French court never forgot. The grandeur of processions, the fascination with perfumes and fortune-telling, the cautious diplomacy that measured every word. And the rumours remained. For generations, pamphleteers painted her as the architect of every dark deed of the 16th century. The street, Bartholomew's Day massacre, the death of rivals, the corruption of kings. They called her La Reine Noire, the Black Queen. Painters portrayed her with shadowed eyes, her hands resting on a vial or a dagger. Historians, later and calmer, found no proof of her poisons, only the usual tools of Renaissance politics: letters, treaties, marriages, betrayals. Yet the legend endured because it answered a deeper human, craving the need to give chaos a single, comprehensible villain. Catherine was convenient. She was foreign, female, and powerful, and so she became the story's poison. Today, if you stand in the quiet galleries of the Château de Chenonceau, her presence lingers more gently. The floors are tiled in black and white, like a chessboard. The river Cher flows beneath the arches she built to join the 2 banks, a bridge that is also a corridor, a symbol of her life's balancing act. In the small chapel, sunlight filters through stained glass onto the Medici coat of arms. 6 red balls on a field of gold. It is a modest emblem for a dynasty that once bought the favour of kings. Here, Catherine's portraits show her not as a witch or conspirator, but as a tired mother, her lips thin, her eyes cautious, the weight of decades in her gaze. If one listens closely, perhaps one can still hear the echo of her careful footsteps on the stone, the rhythm of a woman who measured time not by hours, but by survival. Her story, stripped of its melodrama, is not about poison at all. It is about endurance, the art of staying alive when everyone else expects your failure. In a century where men killed for faith and power, Catherine's weapon was patience. She governed a nation that could not decide what it believed, and for nearly 30 years, she kept it from dissolving entirely. That, perhaps, is her real alchemy, the transformation of fragility into longevity. And yet, one cannot help wondering, as the night grows still and the river outside Chenonceau glides past her stone arches, did Catherine de' Medici ever believe she had succeeded? Or did she know, in those final, breathless moments, that all her balancing, her building, her bargaining had been nothing more than a way of postponing the inevitable, that history, like the river, flows on, indifferent to the walls we raise to contain it? The story begins not with war or conquest, but with mud, thick, grey, unremarkable mud, the kind that clings to boots, dulls the colour of clothing, and smells faintly of the river after rain. It is the mud of northern China in the 6th century, near the banks of the Yellow River. And from this mud, one of the greatest feats of human engineering would rise a canal so vast, so ordinary in purpose, that it would feed a nation for over 1,000 years. You are standing beside a shallow trench in the year 605 CE. The emperor is Yang of Sui, ruler of a recently unified China. He is not remembered kindly. Historians would later call him a tyrant, indulgent, and wasteful. But for a brief, shining moment at the height of his reign, Emperor Yang imagined a connection that no dynasty before him had achieved to link the great rivers of China to move grain and armies and messages as swiftly by water as others might by road. The Grand Canal, as it would later be known, was not born in a single stroke of inspiration. It was a culmination, the stitching together of older, local canals, some dating back to the Zhou dynasty. But Emperor Yang saw something greater. The north, rich in politics but poor in harvest, needed the grain of the south, the fertile lands of the Yangtze Basin. The south, abundant but distant, needed access to the imperial heart. The canal would be their artery, and so, in a command issued from his palace in Luoyang, the emperor ordered the earth itself to bend to his will. The first stage began between the Huai River and the Yellow River, a region already crisscrossed by irrigation ditches and seasonal floods. Tens of thousands of laborers were summoned, farmers, soldiers, and convicts, pressed into service by the imperial government. They worked under the command of Yuan Kai, one of the most skilled engineers of his time. Yuan had already built palaces, roads, and reservoirs. Now he was tasked with taming entire river systems. The laborers dug with simple tools, wooden shovels, wicker baskets, and their own endurance. The days were long, the work repetitive. And the deaths frequent. The chronicles mention 1 million men employed, though this is likely an exaggeration. Imperial records often measured effort in grandeur rather than accuracy. Still, the workforce numbered in the hundreds of thousands, drawn from across the provinces. They dug through clay and stone, cut embankments, and lined the canal with tamped earth reinforced by willow roots. The sound of picks and water carts echoed across the plain. Every 10 li, an overseer with a bamboo whip kept rhythm. Progress was measured not in miles, but in bodies, the unending exchange of human strength for imperial vision. The emperor visited often. He traveled in a fleet of gilded barges, bringing musicians, concubines, and his court. To the workers, he must have seemed less a man than a celestial being. Surrounded by parasols and perfumed smoke, he offered sacrifices to the river gods, praying that the waters would yield to his ambition. Behind the ceremonies lay the simple, grinding logic of empire. Grain must move north to feed soldiers and officials, or the dynasty would starve. In a sense, the Grand Canal was not a monument of luxury, but of logistics. The canal grew like a creeping vein across the landscape. It began near Luoyang, the capital, and extended southward toward Hangzhou, connecting the Yellow River, Huai River, and Yangtze River systems. By the time of its completion, it stretched over 1,700 kilometers, the longest artificial waterway in the world. Its surface was calm, but beneath that calm lay centuries of human labor and centuries more of subtle power. For what the canal moved was not only water and grain, but also people and ideas. Boatmen from Jiangnan learned the dialects of Shandong. Merchants from Suzhou traded silk for northern wheat. Officials traveled by barge, their journeys measured not in perilous days overland, but in the slow, meditative rhythm of the current. China, which had always been vast and divided by geography, was suddenly connected not by conquest, but by infrastructure. Yet for the workers who built it, the canal was misery. The official histories record the marvel, not the suffering. But folk songs of the era tell a different story, of families separated, of farmers who never returned, of the smell of stagnant water where so many had drowned. One verse, preserved in a later anthology, reads, "We dig not earth, but graves. The river swallows names like stones. The emperor's barge floats above us, while our bones lie beneath the flow." The poem was banned, of course, yet it survived, whispered through generations of boatmen, a reminder that every empire floats on the invisible labor of its people. Emperor Yang's canal did more than feed his armies. It shifted the axis of China's economy. Before its construction, the political north relied on perilous overland routes for supplies from the southern provinces. Now, barges of rice could glide steadily from the fertile plains of Yangzhou up to the granaries of Luoyang and Chang'an. Taxes could be collected more efficiently. Armies could move faster. The emperor's control extended like the canal itself, quietly, efficiently, irresistibly. But with every mile of waterway, discontent grew. The peasants conscripted for canal labor were the same ones taxed to fill it with grain. The empire that fed itself so smoothly began to choke on resentment. The grandeur of the project that united the rivers could not unite the people. When rebellion finally broke out against Emperor Yang, many of the rebels were men who had once dug his canal. And yet, centuries later, when the Sui dynasty fell and the Tang rose in its place, the canal endured. It was expanded, deepened, and refined. Its locks improved, its banks lined with stone. Each dynasty that followed cursed Emperor Yang for his vanity and quietly used his waterway. By the Song dynasty, nearly every major city in eastern China was connected to the Grand Canal. It became the pulse of the empire, carrying rice north, timber south, porcelain east, and soldiers west. Along its banks rose market towns, temples, and rest stations. Even poets, often too refined for such practical marvels, found inspiration in its quiet flow. The Tang poet Bai Juyi wrote of the barges as slow clouds crossing the land, and of the canal itself as a river that man persuaded to dream. And so, what began as a tyrant's ambition became a nation's backbone. The Grand Canal outlasted dynasties, emperors, wars, and revolutions. Its waters still flow today, though parts have silted and shrunk, and modern highways now mirror its ancient path. It is both a triumph of engineering and a monument to the paradox of history, that greatness often emerges from suffering, and that the most enduring legacies are the quietest ones. If you listen closely to the wind over the water near Hangzhou, you might still hear the faint echo of wooden shovels, the call of overseers, the creak of oxen pulling carts of earth. The canal endures, and through it, so does the labor of millions of forgotten hands. Yet the question remains, was the Grand Canal truly a symbol of unity, or simply the longest scar ever carved into the land by an empire that could not rest? The Grand Canal did not end when the digging stopped. In many ways, it only began to live once the first barges set out from the southern ports, heavy with rice, oil, and silk. The sound of the oars, the slap of the water against the hull, the rhythm of polemen calling to one another in the dawn. Mist, these, became the heartbeat of imperial China. It was not glamorous work. In the still hours before sunrise, the canal's surface was shrouded in fog, and boatmen wrapped their heads in cloth against the chill. They moved their barges not with sails, but by poles and tow ropes. Teams of men, or sometimes oxen, trudged along narrow towpaths that ran beside the water. Each step was measured, each pull deliberate. From Hangzhou, through Suzhou, Yangzhou, and onward toward Luoyang, they followed the canal's winding arteries, carrying grain to feed the north, a journey that could take weeks, sometimes months. The canal was, above all, about rice, the empire's most essential commodity. Rice was life. It was tax, salary, food, and offering. In the Tang and Song dynasties, entire offices were established to manage the transport of rice along the canal, called the Grain Transport Bureau. Its officials recorded every sack, every weight, every loss to spoilage or theft. The bureaucracy that grew along the canal was as intricate as the waterway itself. Inspectors, accountants, dockmasters, and clerks, all moving papers that mirrored the movement of boats. Every shipment of rice was documented 3 times, once when it left the granaries of the south, once when it arrived at a regional depot, and again when it reached the imperial storehouses in the north. If a sack went missing, there would be investigations. If too many were missing, there would be punishments. And yet, despite the strict system, corruption ran as quietly as the water itself. Officials sometimes declared smaller loads, selling the remainder privately. Boatmen sometimes lost cargo to the depths of the canal, only to recover it later under the cover of darkness. The empire's prosperity floated on an undercurrent of deception, as smooth and silent as the canal's surface. By the Tang dynasty, the canal had transformed China's geography. It was no longer just a line between rivers. It was the invisible hinge of the empire's stability. Grain moved northward in endless procession, allowing the capital cities, first Chang'an, later Kaifeng, and Beijing, to sustain populations that otherwise could never have survived their arid surroundings. Without the canal, northern China would have starved. With it, the empire could thrive. The Tang emperors knew this, and they treated the canal not merely as a tool, but as a sacred artery. Each spring, before the first grain shipments departed, the emperor would hold a water opening ceremony. Offerings were made to the river gods, incense burned, and jade cups of wine poured into the canal's waters. The emperor himself would touch a golden paddle to the current, symbolically guiding the year's first barge toward the north. Behind the ritual, however, lay a practical fear that the canal might silt, flood, or freeze, disrupting the empire's most critical flow. To maintain it was to maintain order itself. In the southern provinces, where the canal passed through fertile land, entire towns grew around its banks. The port of Yangzhou, once a modest settlement, became one of the wealthiest cities in the world. Its markets overflowed with goods, silks from Suzhou, ceramics from Jingdezhen, and spices from the southern seas. The canal allowed merchants to send their wares not only to the emperor's court, but across thousands of miles of inland waterways. Even commoners who never left their province could feel its effects cheaper. Rice, more stable markets, a greater flow of goods and people. The canal made the empire smaller, more connected, and paradoxically, more dependent on its own machinery. Yet not everyone benefited equally. More rementu. The same canal that carried rice northward also carried taxes southward, measured in silver, copper coins, and bureaucratic orders. The government's efficiency meant that the burden of production fell ever more heavily on the peasantry. Rice farmers of Jiangnan saw their harvests disappear into the state granaries. The richer the north grew, the poorer the south became. The Grand Canal, meant to unify, also divided a current of prosperity flowing one way, and resentment flowing back the other. Still, the canal held its quiet majesty. Along its banks, life unfolded with a steady rhythm. The creak of mooring ropes, the chatter of porters, the clatter of bamboo abacuses in counting houses. Tea houses lined the waterways, serving weary travellers. Temples rose beside the docks, their bells echoing across the mist. Even the canal's locks and sluices became miniature worlds, each with its own crew of caretakers, engineers, and local gods. Stone tablets, carved with imperial edicts, warned against dumping waste or fishing too close to the gates, but fishermen ignored them all the same. By the Song dynasty, new technologies refined the canal's operation. Engineers developed more sophisticated lock systems, allowing barges to move between sections of different water levels. Canal maintenance became a profession in itself. Teams known as Water Repair Corps traveled the length of the canal, dredging silt, repairing embankments, and reinforcing bridges. They worked quietly, often unseen, ensuring that the empire's lifeblood continued to flow. If the emperor was the heart of China, the canal was its circulatory system, and the Water Repair Corps were its physicians. Trade along the canal became so intense that towns evolved into cities overnight. Kaifeng, the northern Song capital, was one such city, its granaries stacked high with rice from the south, its streets alive with merchants from every corner of the empire. Foreign visitors marveled at how goods could travel entirely by water from Hangzhou to the capital without ever touching open sea. The Grand Canal was, in many ways, China's first great highway, and far older than any Roman road. But the canal was fragile too. Flooding was a constant threat. The Yellow River, notoriously unpredictable, often overflowed its banks and deposited vast amounts of silt into the canal's northern sections. Each flood demanded repair. Each repair demanded labor, and each call for labor tested the patience of the people. During bad years, whole stretches of the canal became unnavigable. The flow of grain halted, and with it, the flow of the empire's confidence. One official wrote that when the canal stops, the nation holds its breath. Despite these challenges, the canal endured. Dynasties rose and fell. The Tang, the Song, the Yuan. But the canal remained indispensable. When the Mongols conquered China and established the Yuan dynasty in the 13th century, even they recognized its value. Kublai Khan ordered extensive repairs, extending the northern section all the way to Beijing, his new capital. The Mongols, who once roamed the grasslands on horseback, now relied on the quiet rhythm of barges to feed their empire. The Yuan engineers introduced new innovations, broader channels, stronger embankments, and better locks. The canal's management became a multi-ethnic enterprise. Chinese engineers, Persian architects, and Central Asian overseers, working side by side. Each understood that the canal was more than an engineering marvel. It was the key to controlling China itself. He who commanded the flow of grain commanded the flow of power. Through it all, the people who lived and worked along the canal continued their quiet routines. Generations of boatmen passed their skills from father to son. Some families lived entirely on barges, their children growing up knowing the shape of the riverbanks better than the streets of any city. They developed their own dialects, their own superstitions, never setting out on certain days, always making offerings of tea or rice wine to the water spirits before departing. To them, the canal was both workplace and world, both danger and home. And yet, beneath this surface of order and motion, change was stirring. The canal had tied the empire together for centuries, but in doing so, it had also bound it too tightly to an ancient rhythm. New trade routes by sea were emerging. Foreign merchants from Arabia, India, and later Europe began to bypass the inland routes altogether. The south, once the empire's granary, was becoming the empire's gateway to the world. The Grand Canal, majestic, muddy, eternal, was slowly being left behind by time itself. Still, for centuries more, the emperors clung to it. They could not let go of the comfort. It represented the image of a perfectly ordered realm, where every grain of rice could be traced from field to palace. It was bureaucracy in physical form, a river that obeyed human law, even when droughts dried its channels or floods destroyed its locks. Officials continued to send reports, to issue commands, to dream of restoration. They were, in their way, as bound to the canal as the boatmen who poled their barges through its fog. The Grand Canal was more than infrastructure. It was ideology. It represented the emperor's promise. that all things could be managed, measured, and made to flow according to plan. But as centuries passed and the canal's silt deepened, so too did the silt of bureaucracy. Records grew thicker, reports piled higher, and the once living waterway began to feel like a metaphor, a system so vast that even the emperor could not see where it began or where it ended. The canal endured, yes, but endurance, like water, can be both strength and stagnation. And so, as the Ming dynasty approached, another emperor would gaze upon the canal's aging waters and ask the question that had haunted rulers for centuries. Could something built to serve an empire survive once the empire itself began to crumble? The Grand Canal had been a river of empire, and like all rivers, it began to age. Its waters, once clear and swift, thickened with silt and history. Dynasties had been born beside it. Armies had marched along it. Merchants had built their fortunes upon it. But now, in the age of the Ming and Qing dynasties, the canal was becoming both lifeline and liability, a mirror of China itself. Magnificent, yet decaying at the edges. By the early 1400s, the Ming emperors had moved their capital from Nanjing to Beijing, far to the north. It was a bold decision, politically wise, logistically perilous. Beijing was dry, its land poor in agriculture, dependent entirely on the south for food. Once again, the canal was called upon to do the impossible, to carry millions of tons of rice from the fertile Yangtze basin up through the heart of the empire, to feed a distant, thirsty city. Emperor Yongle, who had already built the Forbidden City and sent fleets to explore the seas, understood that his new capital would live or die by the canal. He ordered massive repairs. Thousands of engineers were mobilized. The Beijing-Hangzhou Grand Canal, as it would now be known, was deepened, redirected, and reinforced with stone embankments. A new section, called the Tonghui River, was carved to connect the canal directly to Beijing. The cost was staggering, measured not only in silver, but in the lives of those who worked it. But it worked. For another 4 centuries, Beijing would eat, because the canal endured. The Ming administration turned canal transport into a science. Rice shipments were organized into convoys of standardized barges, each carrying between 500 and 1,000 dun of grain. Each convoy was overseen by an appointed grain transport commissioner, responsible for every sack, every delay, every accident along the way. Checkpoints at Yangzhou, Huai'an, and Linqing tracked progress meticulously. Every boatman carried stamped documents. Every cargo was sealed with imperial wax. It was bureaucracy in motion, elegant, and utterly dependent on the smooth flow of water. But the water did not always obey. The Yellow River, China's great deceiver, changed course repeatedly. Each time it did, it poured vast amounts of silt into the canal's channels, choking the flow. Floods destroyed embankments. Droughts left stretches unnavigable. Engineers fought back with dredging and diversion projects, but nature moved faster than the state. The Ming dynasty, already strained by wars and corruption, began to lose control of its waterways. By the late 1500s, grain convoys were arriving late, spoiled, or half lost to river pirates. The lifeblood of the empire was slowing to a crawl. Yet life, along the canal, persisted. In towns like Huai'an and Yangzhou, trade still flourished. Barge captains still drank tea at the docks. Merchants still haggled over silk and porcelain. The canal was no longer just a means of survival. It had become a culture of its own. Canal songs, canal cuisine, canal festivals. 1,000 local traditions flowed along its banks, blending into the story of everyday China. Yangzhou, in particular, became a city of paradox. It was built on the suffering of laborers, yet famous for its gardens and pleasure quarters. Wealthy merchants who profited from the rice trade built pavilions overlooking the water, their walls decorated with paintings of the very barges that made their fortunes possible. In poetry, the canal was romanticized as a place of calm reflection, its hardships conveniently forgotten. The Qing poet Yuan Mei once wrote, "The canal glimmers like a ribbon of jade, its surface hiding the toil beneath. Who remembers the hands that dug it, or the feet that wore its paths thin?" The canal's decline was slow, almost imperceptible at first. In the 1600s, the Ming fell to rebellion and Manchu invasion, but the Qing kept the canal alive. They repaired its locks, reorganized its grain fleets, and even built new warehouses along its banks. The Emperor Kangxi, perhaps the most diligent of the Qing rulers, personally inspected sections of the canal during his tours of the south. He admired its engineering, its usefulness, its beauty, but even he noticed the signs of exhaustion: the crumbling stonework, the silting channels, the corruption that seeped into every level of administration. For centuries, the canal had been managed through a system of tribute grain. Farmers in the south paid part of their taxes in rice, which was shipped north to feed the capital and the army. But by the 18th century, new economic forces were emerging. Silver had become the preferred medium of tax payment, and maritime trade along the coast was booming. Foreign merchants, Portuguese, Dutch, British, brought wealth and goods through ports like Canton and Shanghai, bypassing the canal entirely. The once vital inland waterway was slowly being overshadowed by the sea. And yet, the canal refused to die. Its waters still carried local trade, even as imperial convoys diminished. Its towns remained hubs of small industry, silk weaving, lacquer work, pottery. Fishermen still cast their nets from its banks, and families still gathered in the evenings to watch the barges drift past. The canal had ceased to be an artery of empire and had become something gentler, a landscape of memory. By the 19th century, however, decline could no longer be denied. The Yellow River changed course again in 1855, devastating large portions of the canal network. Sections dried out, others became stagnant marsh. The newly arrived Western steamships on the coast made canal transport seem archaic and slow. What had once been a miracle of coordination now looked like an anachronism, a relic of the world before railways. In 1852, Emperor Xianfeng received a report from his engineers. It stated bluntly that maintaining the Grand Canal had become impossible without bankrupting the treasury. Within a decade, the imperial grain fleets were disbanded, and supplies were transported by sea instead. The canal, after 1,200 years of service, was finally allowed to rest. But rest is not the same as silence. The canal continued to whisper through the countryside, through generations of memory. Even as weeds grew over its banks, people still followed its curve when building new roads and towns. In many places, its course became the invisible foundation for modern infrastructure, railways, highways, and pipelines, tracing the same ancient routes. In others, it became a quiet refuge. Fishermen casting lines where once emperors had sent fleets. And so, in the modern age, the Grand Canal survives not as a monument, but as a ghost that never left. From Hangzhou to Beijing, fragments of the old waterway still glimmer in the sun, their surfaces reflecting both sky and history. Some stretches have been restored, their locks rebuilt for tourism. Others remain wild, overgrown with reeds, their stone embankments half buried in soil. In the cities, it appears suddenly a calm ribbon of water between concrete buildings, older than anything that surrounds it. For those who live beside it, the canal is simply there, ordinary, constant, familiar. Children play on its banks. Elderly men sit on folding stools, smoking and watching the slow current. They may not know the names of Emperor Yang, Yuan Kai, or the countless engineers who built it, But in every reflection that ripples across the surface, the past is still present, quiet, patient, and enduring. There is a certain comfort in that, isn't there? To know that something born of human labor, sustained by human suffering, can outlast even the idea of empire itself. The Grand Canal began as a vision of control, the belief that rivers could be commanded, that geography could be conquered. It ended as something far humbler, a reminder that time itself is the only true engineer. And perhaps that is the quiet beauty of the Grand Canal story. It does not demand admiration. It does not boast of glory. It simply exists flowing, silting, fading, enduring, much as history itself does. Not every triumph resounds in trumpets. Some whisper in water, and sometimes the most powerful achievements are those that, after centuries, still teach us the patience to flow. So tonight, as you imagine the moonlight glimmering on that long ribbon of water, think of the hands that dug it, the boats that crossed it, and the empires that rose and fell beside it. The canal remains, neither fully alive nor dead, a current of memory winding endlessly through the heart of China. And perhaps, somewhere beneath the surface, the ghosts of the workers still hum their old songs. Steady, rhythmic, eternal. It begins in silence. Not the silence of peace, but the silence that follows conquest. The uneasy stillness of a land trying to remember what normal life used to sound like. It is England, the year 1085, and the wind across the winter fields smells of smoke and earth. Villages lie quiet beneath a grey sky. The Norman conquest is nearly 20 years old, and yet, for many, it feels like the occupation began only yesterday. Castles rise like scars across the landscape, foreign lords rule from their keeps, and the old English nobility, those who survived, live now as guests in their own country. At the centre of it all stands William I, known to history as William the Conqueror. He is a man nearing the end of his reign, and perhaps of his patience. For 2 decades he has ruled England with a mailed fist, dividing the land among his Norman followers, enforcing his will through stone and sword. But he does not trust what he cannot count. And the thing he cannot count not yet is England itself. It is said that one winter evening, in his hall at Gloucester, William sat listening to reports from his sheriffs and reeves. He heard of disputes over land, of lost revenues, of hidden taxes. The king, ever practical, wanted certainty. He wanted to know, in his own words, what or how much each man held, in land or livestock, and what it was worth. He wanted a survey of his realm, total, exact, and final. Thus was born one of the strangest and most ambitious documents in history, the Domesday Book. The name would come later, coined by those who saw in it something ominous, a record so thorough, so indisputable, that it seemed like a final judgment. But in that winter of 1085, it was simply the survey, an attempt to make sense of a conquered kingdom through the language of numbers and ink. The king's order spread like frost. Messengers rode out from Gloucester in all directions, carrying royal writs sealed in green wax. Each writ was addressed to a shire's sheriff and its barons, commanding them to gather inquests, to summon juries, and to account for every acre and animal in their charge. The scale of the task was staggering. England, in the 11th century, was a patchwork of shires, hundreds, and villes, an intricate network of local jurisdictions that had evolved since Saxon times. No one had ever attempted to record them all at once, but the Normans were nothing if not methodical. They divided the kingdom like a ledger, line by line, manor by manor, name by name. At the lowest level, 12 men were chosen from each 100, half Norman, half English, to give sworn testimony. They were asked questions so detailed that even now they astonish historians. How much land was there, and who held it before the conquest? How many ploughs? How many oxen? How many villagers, cottages, slaves? How much woodland, meadow, pasture, and fish pond? How much was it worth in the time of King Edward? And how much now? The jurors swore their answers under oath before the king's commissioners, royal agents appointed to collect the data. These men were not warriors but administrators, clerks and chaplains, many trained in the schools of Normandy, familiar with both Latin and the slow arithmetic of governance. They rode from village to village, recording the testimony in rough notes on parchment sheets, the first drafts of what would one day become the Domesday Book. Imagine them, cloaked against the rain, ink freezing in their wells, their horses sinking in the winter mud. They sit in the smoky hall of a village reeve, surrounded by wary faces. The questions are read aloud, the answers murmured in dialects thick with Saxon syllables. The clerk translates, counts, and writes terra est dimidia hida. The land is half a hide. Every measurement is approximate, yet together they form a mosaic of extraordinary precision. Behind this flurry of counting was a deeper motive. William needed more than knowledge. He needed control. A conquered land is hard to rule without knowing who owns what and who owes what. The survey was not an act of curiosity. It was an act of power. Through it, William could verify the feudal chain, every lord, tenant, and subtenant, traced back, ultimately, to himself. The king owned all the land of England, in theory, but in practice, it had been distributed in fragments to barons, knights, abbots, and bishops. Each held their estates in return for military service or taxes. But confusion reigned. Records were inconsistent, and rival claims multiplied. By ordering the survey, William was asserting a truth greater than all of them, that every acre of England was his to account for. The commissioners returned to their circuits again and again. They checked boundaries, compared testimonies, inspected fields, counted livestock. Sometimes they recorded disputes, two lords claiming the same meadow, or a church arguing over tithes. Sometimes they noted curiosities, a beehive that paid rent, a mill worth 4 shillings, a piggery beside a salt pan. The Domesday Book, for all its grandeur, is filled with such minutiae. It reads like the diary of an entire nation. Every pond and pasture, every lost tax and fallen manor. At the heart of this machine sat the royal treasury at Winchester, where a small army of scribes began the immense task of compiling the notes into a coherent record. We do not know their names, but we know their handwriting. Careful, angular, deliberate. They wrote in Latin, the language of administration, but used English measurements, hides, carucates, virgates. Each line is a miniature world, condensed to its essentials. In Writtle, Ethelric held 1 hide of land. Now Geoffrey holds it from the king. There is land for 2 ploughs. In Demene, 1 plough and 2 slaves. Meadow for 2 oxen. It was worth 20 shillings. Now, 40. Such sentences are neither poetry nor prose, and yet they pulse with the quiet rhythm of life itself, the invisible machinery that keeps a kingdom alive. The scribes worked quickly. By 1086, the book was nearly complete, a miracle of organization, in an age without printing or standard maps. Each shire was listed in turn, its lords and lands, described in sequence, cross-referenced to the holdings of tenants-in-chief. When finished, it was bound in 2 volumes, Great Domesday and Little Domesday. The former covered most of England. The latter, the counties of Norfolk, Suffolk, and Essex, preserved in fuller detail. When the book was presented to the king, it must have been an extraordinary sight. A single manuscript containing the bones of a nation, the names of 13,418 places, 269,000 households, and untold acres of field and forest. It was not beautiful in the way of illuminated gospels or royal charters. It was plain, functional, austere, but in its plainness, lay its power. For the first time, a medieval ruler had reduced an entire kingdom to record, and therefore to rule. The chronicler, Orderic Vitalis, writing years later, described the awe it inspired. So narrowly did he have it investigated that there was not a single hide, nor one ox, nor one cow, nor one pig left out. To the common people, the survey seemed less like a census and more like a judgment. They called it Domesday. Not doomsday in the apocalyptic sense, but Domesday, from dom, meaning judgment or reckoning. For in the King's Book, once written, nothing could be changed. If it was recorded that you owned 3 acres, then 3 acres you owned, no more, no less. It was final, like the judgment of God. The Domesday Book became both tool and symbol, a manifestation of Norman order imposed upon Saxon chaos. It anchored the new feudal system, fixed taxes, and settled disputes, yet it also froze the social structure in place. For centuries, the hierarchy it described would remain largely intact. The king at the top, the barons beneath him, the peasants at the bottom, all bound by the invisible ink of feudal obligation. Even now, nearly 1,000 years later, the Domesday Book endures a window into a world so distant it feels half imagined. Open its pages in the British Library, and you can still see the dark, faded script, the faint impressions where quills once scratched parchment. It smells faintly of dust and age and ink, as though time itself has seeped into its fibres. It is, in a sense, the oldest surviving database in Europe. And behind every number lies a story of loss, of ambition, of survival. But there is one mystery the Domesday Book never answers. Who, exactly, wrote it? Not in the bureaucratic sense, the team of scribes we can identify by their script, but the mind behind the vision, the architect who turned the king's vague demand into the most comprehensive administrative record of the medieval world. Who was the clerk who counted the world? If you walk through the echoing stone corridors of Winchester Cathedral today, you might imagine that the air once smelled not only of candle wax and incense, but of ink thick, oily, and black. For in this city, around the year 1086, England's heart was not in its castles or its courts of war, but in a room of clerks bent over parchment, copying the world into permanence. These men were not warriors. They wielded no swords, commanded no troops, yet their pens did what the blade could not. They fixed a conquered kingdom into law. The work took place near the royal treasury, the old Minster precinct, where the exchequer was beginning to form its habits. This was a time before government had offices in the modern sense. Royal administration was wherever the king's will was written down. That will now took the shape of the Domesday Book, and the men of Winchester were its architects. They are anonymous to history, but not invisible. Their handwriting, the firm, angular Latin of the 11th century, still bears their fingerprints of character. Scholars who have studied the manuscript closely can distinguish them by their strokes. One with a sharp, hurried hand, another slow and deliberate, a third whose letters slope with fatigue. Together, they copied and edited the raw materials of the Domesday Inquest. The surveyor's notes brought in from every shire in England. Each bundle of parchment represented weeks of testimony, argument, and inspection. The scribe's job was to make it uniform, concise, and usable. The raw notes were messy, full of repetition, contradiction, and local detail. A manor might be described twice, once under one lord, once under another. Place names were spelled differently, even within the same document. The scribes of Winchester had to impose order on this chaos to transform hundreds of local inquests into a single, logical survey. To do this, they used a formulaic structure, one that would make any bureaucrat proud. Each entry followed the same pattern. Who held the land in 1066, before the conquest? Who holds it now, under King William? What the land consists of ploughlands, meadows, woods, mills, fisheries. Who lives there? Villagers, smallholders, slaves. What it is worth, both then and now. The scribes omitted poetry, opinion, and unnecessary words. They stripped human lives to their essentials: land, labour, and value. What remained was a ledger of England, as William saw it, a realm of resources to be taxed, defended, and claimed. Imagine the scriptorium, the long tables, the low light of afternoon filtering through narrow windows, the steady sound of quills scratching parchment. The ink would have been made from oak galls, iron salts, and wine dark, lasting, slightly corrosive. The parchment was vellum, stretched and scraped sheepskin, smooth under the hand. Each sheet was precious. Mistakes could not easily be erased, so every sentence was measured before it was written. The scribes worked under a discipline, both spiritual and administrative. Most were clerics-educated men attached to the cathedral or royal chapel. Their literacy was a kind of priesthood. Writing itself was sacred labour, a form of obedience. And yet, in this project, their piety served a worldly cause: the consolidation of Norman rule. To the monks of Winchester, the work may have seemed endless. The surveyors' bundles kept arriving from the shires of Wessex, from Mercia, from the Danelaw in the north. Each one carried the weight of the king's expectation. The winter of 1085-1086 had been harsh. There were rumours of invasion from Denmark. William needed to know exactly what forces he could raise, and from where. The Domesday Book was, at its core, an inventory for war. A record of how many men, horses, and hides of land could be summoned to the king's defence. The scribes, though, dealt not with armies but with abbreviations. They wrote in a compressed Latin that modern readers find cryptic. Words were shortened to single letters. Numbers were indicated by marks. The phrase 5 hides of land became vi hide terrae. In domene one plough was in dominio, I caruca. To the trained eye, the page looked almost mathematical, grid of property and obligation. At times, the monotony of the work must have been unbearable. Entry after entry, manner after manner, all following the same pattern. And yet there is something strangely hypnotic about it. A rhythm, a quiet persistence. In this repetition lies the heartbeat of medieval administration, the belief that order, once written, could be made real. Beyond the scriptorium, England continued to shift under the Norman hand. The great castles of Rochester, Durham, Warwick, and Nottingham were rising, stone by stone. Forests were being enclosed as royal preserves. The old Anglo-Saxon nobility had all but vanished, replaced by men with French names: de Warenne, de Clare, de Percy. Each of them owed fealty to the king, and each of them would find his holdings listed, line by line, in the Great Book. The Domesday Survey also captured something far quieter: the survival of the ordinary. Amid the accounting of hides and ploughs, the scribes noted things like mills, beehives, salt pans, and fisheries. These details seemed trivial, but they were the backbone of England's wealth. A mill could bring in 10 shillings a year. A fishery might feed an entire manor. Even a small wood, noted simply as silver pastilis de XX porcis, wood for 20 pigs, was worth recording. Through such measurements, the book reveals not grandeur, but continuity, the steady persistence of everyday labour. Consider, for a moment, how this must have looked to those being surveyed. A Norman official rides into a small village, men with foreign accents, armed, cloaked, bearing the king's seal. They summon 12 locals and question them. Who owned this meadow? How many oxen plough here? How much rent do you pay? To an illiterate peasant, it must have seemed as though the king's gaze could see into the very soil. When the results reached Winchester, they became abstractions, numbers on parchment. But for the people of England, they were very real. The Domesday Book determined taxes, confirmed ownership, and sometimes dispossessed those who could not prove their claims. A single line of Latin could make or unmake a life. And yet, curiously, there are hints of compassion, or at least of curiosity, among the clerks. In one entry, a manor is said to have been laid waste by the king's order. In another, the villagers fled because of the forest. The scribes recorded these facts without emotion, but the inclusion of such notes suggests an awareness that the kingdom was not merely a ledger, it was a landscape of human struggle. By the spring of 1086, the work neared completion. In May, the scribes prepared a summary version, what we now call Great Domesday Book. They condensed the raw inquests into a streamlined master copy, written on uniform pages. Only Norfolk, Suffolk and Essex remained in their longer, rougher form preserved in what we now call Little Domesday. The result was astonishing. A document spanning all of England south of the River Tees, with over 13,000 place names and hundreds of thousands of individual data points. The precision was so unusual for the time that it took on an almost supernatural authority. The people called it Domesday because, as one chronicler said, it spared no man, not even the smallest. When the clerks presented the finished manuscript to William, the king is said to have been pleased, perhaps even satisfied. He now possessed, for the first time in European history, a near-complete statistical model of a nation. He could know, at a glance, who held what land, who owed what taxes, and how much wealth each region produced. It was control made visible, written, bound, and stored in the treasury. But the book's meaning went beyond administration. In its pages, England became something it had never been before, measurable, no longer a collection of fiefdoms and customs, but a single system of obligations and rights, defined by writing. It was, in a sense, the birth of English bureaucracy, the quiet revolution that underlies all future empires. Even now, reading the Domesday Book feels like eavesdropping on ghosts. Each line, sparse and factual, hints at a life once lived. You can almost hear the rustle of reeds by a fish pond, the creak of a mill wheel, the lowing of oxen. The clerks who wrote these things did not set out to preserve beauty, but in their precision, they captured it by accident. There is one entry, for instance, describing the town of Ely in Cambridgeshire. In the time of King Edward, there were 46 burgesses. Now there are 40. The bishop has a market there, and toll and team, and all customary dues. It is a line without emotion, yet behind it lies a story of loss. 6 families gone, their houses empty, their names forgotten. The clerk recorded it without comment, and moved on. By late summer of 1086, the scribes laid down their quills. The final parchment was dried, polished, and bound. The king, satisfied, ordered his barons to assemble at Salisbury, where they swore an oath of loyalty to him, against all men. In that oath, and in that book, the machinery of Norman rule was complete. And yet, for all its order, the Domesday Book leaves us with one lingering question. One that the scribes themselves might never have asked aloud. Did the act of counting England bring the kingdom closer to truth, or simply reduce it to numbers? In the year 1087, as summer waned, and the fields turned golden under the Norman sun, William the Conqueror lay dying. He was far from Winchester, far from the thick parchment that bore his dominion in ink. The king's body, once armoured and broad, had thinned to a shadow of itself. He died not in triumph, but in pain, injured in France, surrounded by murmuring clerics and the smell of wax and herbs. And as the bells tolled, England's first great surveyor left behind not only a crown, but a ledger, the Domesday Book, his final mirror of power. When the news reached England, the great book sat quietly in the treasury at Winchester. The ink had dried, the scribes had dispersed, the work was done. And yet, in a strange way, the book had only just begun to live, the living ledger. In the decades that followed, the Domesday Book became something more than a tool. It became a standard of truth. When disputes arose over land, the royal clerks turned to its pages. When abbots quarrelled with barons, or sons with fathers, they sought the authority of the king's survey. To be written in the book was to exist in law. To be absent was to risk vanishing from it. The book was, by design, final. No entries were to be added, no lines erased. The ink might fade, but the words could not be changed. It was as if the land itself had been frozen in time. The hills, the meadows, the boundaries of 1,000 forgotten fields. That rigidity made the Domesday Book both revered and feared. To the monks who Tentines, one, saw it in the treasury, it carried an almost biblical gravity. To the peasants whose villages it described, it was a distant but unyielding presence, the king's gaze, preserved in writing. And to the generations of rulers who followed, it became a foundation. Each new monarch inherited not only the crown, but the record of how their kingdom had once been measured. The book's survival was as miraculous as its making. Through wars, fires, and reformations, it remained in royal custody, first at Winchester, later at Westminster, then in the Public Record Office in London. Even during the bombings of the Second World War, it was moved to safety in a secure vault, wrapped and guarded, like a relic of national identity. Yet despite its endurance, there is something almost tragic about the Domesday Book. It was, in essence, a work of faith. The faith that knowledge can bring order, that by counting a kingdom, you can master it. And while it succeeded on paper, the living world soon escaped its boundaries. The England of the book, the England of the Domesday Book, was a place of astonishing diversity, though its entries rarely reveal it. From the salt marshes of Lincolnshire to the heaths of Dorset, from the woods of Kent to the windswept fens of Cambridgeshire, each region lived by its own rhythms of work and survival. The scribes reduced it all to formula hides and ploughs, villains and bordars, livestock and mills. But behind each Latin line was a web of human experience. There were the villagers, tilling the fields from dawn to dusk, their labour measured not in coin, but in the turning of the seasons. There were the cottagers, living on the margins, their lives counted in half acres and hens. There were the Tins, who had once ruled under Edward the Confessor, now displaced by Norman knights. There were slaves, their existence marked only by the word servi, nameless yet accounted for. There were women, rarely mentioned, except as widows holding small plots of land, the silent inheritors of loss. And there were the monks, who tended to the book itself, the clerks and keepers who read it, quoted it, and guarded it as though it were scripture. To them, it must have seemed that they were preserving not merely data, but a divine reflection of order. In a chaotic world, the Domesday Book was certainty bound in leather. But history, like nature, does not rest easily under measurement. By the 12th century, new towns had emerged that were not listed in the survey. New abbeys had been founded, new forests enclosed, rivers shifted, coastlines eroded, villages recorded as prosperous were abandoned, others, unlisted, began to thrive. The Domesday Book remained unchanged, a snapshot, unblinking, while the world moved on. Still, it endured as a reference point, the root from which later bureaucracies grew. In the age of Henry II, clerks at the Exchequer began to use tally sticks, wax seals, and rolls of parchment to record taxes, and cases a direct descendant of the Domesday method. By the 13th century, England was no longer ruled by conquest, but by record-keeping. It is a quiet evolution, easily overlooked. The sword giving way to the quill, the conquest of land replaced by the conquest of information. And in that transformation, the Domesday Book stands as both beginning and warning. The quiet power of paper. There is something hypnotic about the idea that writing can hold power. For William the Conqueror, the survey was an act of control, a way to define ownership in a conquered land. But for those who followed, it became an act of memory. In a world where so much was transient, famine, war, fire, ink offered a kind of immortality. The clerks of Winchester could not have known that their work would survive for centuries, outliving castles, cathedrals, even dynasties. Their pages would be read by kings and scholars, by archivists and curious travellers. In the margins of those pages, the medieval world would whisper on. The language of the Domesday Book is dry, but its implications are vast. It represents the first time in recorded European history that a government sought to know everything about its people and their possessions. In a way, it is the ancestor of every census, tax record, and national archive that came after. And yet, for all its precision, it leaves us with profound silences. It tells us how many sheep grazed in Yorkshire, but not the names of the shepherds. It records how much woodland stood in Kent, but not the songs sung under its trees. It counts slaves and villagers, but not their laughter, their fears, or the warmth of their hearths. Perhaps that is its most haunting quality, the way it preserves a world by erasing its humanity. Every number in the Domesday Book is, at its heart, a person unremembered. The clerk, who counted the world. Somewhere, among the many scribes of Winchester, there may have been one man, a chief clerk, perhaps, who oversaw the final compilation, who ensured the logic of the layout, who double-checked the totals, who made the Domesday Book coherent. We will never know his name. He might have been born in Normandy, trained in a cathedral school, brought to England after the conquest. He may have stood in the cold treasury hall, the manuscript spread before him, running his fingers over the columns of ink. He would have known the weight of what he held, not in words, but in meaning. He would have known that this book was unlike any other, not a chronicle of saints, not a psalter or gospel, but a testament to earthly order, a map made of sentences, a kingdom made of lines. And perhaps, when the light faded and the candles guttered low, he paused to wonder what it all meant. Was it truly possible to record the whole of England? Could any book, no matter how precise, capture the lives it described? He might have looked up from the parchment, through the narrow window toward the darkening city, the rooftops, the river, the hills beyond, and he would have seen that the world, even as he wrote it down, was already changing. The book that outlasted kings. Over the next 9 centuries, the Domesday Book would pass through many hands. It would survive fires, wars, revolutions, and reforms. It would be copied, studied, photographed, digitized. Its pages would rest beneath glass in the National Archives at Kew, where visitors could peer at its ink as though gazing into the eyes of another world. Each entry, once a matter of taxation and control, is now a fragment of wonder. The name of a vanished hamlet, the first recorded mention of a river, the long-forgotten value of a meadow. What was once a record of power has become a record of persistence, the endurance of writing itself. Even today, when scholars analyze its numbers with computers and databases, they find traces of the same ambition that drove William and his clerks. The desire to know, to measure, to impose order on chaos. It is, in that sense, a medieval mirror of our modern world. For what is a census, a survey, a spreadsheet, but a descendant of that old Norman dream? The Domesday Book ends not with a flourish, but with a sentence so plain it almost disappears. And in all these lands there is one Lord, William the King. It is a simple declaration, yet behind it lies the entire structure of feudal England. The invisible pyramid of oaths, taxes, and obedience. And it reminds us that history often hides its deepest meanings in its dullest lines. The Domesday Book was never meant to inspire. It was meant to account. But in accounting, it accidentally revealed the scope of human ambition, to know, to define, to preserve. It turned the chaos of conquest into the stillness of record, and in doing so, left us a monument of ink more enduring than any stone. So when you picture it, the clerk bent over his parchment in the lamplight, the quiet hum of the treasury, the turning of the final page, imagine also the silence that follows. A silence filled not with finality, but with the gentle hum of time continuing, uncounted, because even the most perfect book cannot measure what lies beyond its margins. The story of the Middle Ages often begins with kings and ends with castles. But perhaps it should begin with something smaller, a handful of grain, because long before the printing press or the compass, before Gothic cathedrals or knights in armour, there was bread, and bread required flour, and flour required grinding. That simple act, crushing grain between stones, sustained entire civilizations, and in time, quietly transformed them. For thousands of years, grinding grain was the work of hands. In small huts from Ireland to Anatolia, people knelt beside querns, two heavy stones. One fixed, one turned, grinding the day's grain with slow, circular motions. It was monotonous, exhausting work. Ancient Roman writers noted that slaves often performed it as punishment. The Greek word mylon meant both mill and toil. But around the 1st century BCE, something remarkable began to happen. In a few scattered valleys of the Roman Empire, millstones started to turn on their own. Water, channeled through wooden troughs, drove a wheel that rotated gears, which in turn spun the grinding stones. A stream became a servant. A river became labour. By the time of the late Roman Empire, watermills dotted the countryside. Not many, but enough to prove the principle. The great complex at Barbagal in southern Gaul, for example, contained 16 wheels aligned down a hillside, capable of grinding enough flour to feed an entire city. It was, in its way, an industrial plant built nearly 2,000 years before the Industrial Revolution. And yet, after Rome fell, many of these machines fell silent. The engineers who built them were gone, their aqueducts broken, their wheels rotted by time. Europe entered what later historians called the Dark Ages, and for a while, people went back to turning grain by hand. But water does not forget how to flow. By the 9th century, the sound of mills began to return slowly, quietly, spreading across the monasteries and manors of medieval Europe. And with that sound came one of the most profound, if understated, transformations in history. In the year 1086, the very same year the Domesday Book was written, England was already humming with water wheels. The survey lists 5,624 mills, a number that scholars believe represents only the larger, taxable ones. In reality, there were likely twice as many. Every river, every stream with a decent fall, was home to a mill. To the people of medieval England, the mill was more than a machine. It was a landmark, a meeting place, and a source of power both mechanical and social. The steady turning of the wheel was the pulse of the village, the sound of life being processed, quite literally, into sustenance. The design was deceptively simple. A wooden wheel stood half in the water, its paddles catching the flow of the stream. The motion was transferred by shafts and gears to the upper millstone, which turned against a lower one fixed in place. Between them, the grain poured down from a hopper, crushed into meal by friction. The rhythm of the grinding stones was constant, hypnotic, a slow thunder that shook the wooden beams. There were two main types of wheel. The undershot wheel, driven by the flow of the stream passing beneath it, was common in flat country. The overshot wheel, where water was channeled to fall from above, was more efficient but required a drop in elevation and careful carpentry. Monasteries often preferred the latter, combining their faith in divine order with a practical interest in physics. For monks, the mill was a blessing. It freed them from the manual labor of grinding grain, allowing more time for prayer, study, and copying manuscripts. The rule of Saint Benedict, which emphasized balance between work and devotion, encouraged the use of tools that served the community. Thus, many abbeys built their own mills, staffed by lay brothers who tended the wheels day and night. The Cistercians, in particular, became masters of this art. Their abbeys were built beside rivers not for beauty, but for utility. They channeled water not only to power mills, but to flush latrines, wash wool, and drive forges. To walk through a Cistercian abbey in the 12th century was to hear the symphony of an engineered landscape. The rush of water through channels, the groan of axles, the steady hum of industry cloaked in prayer. In this sense, the Middle Ages were not as stagnant as they are often portrayed. They were quietly industrious, a world of wood, rope, and water, turning endlessly beneath the surface of history. The social meaning of the mill was complex. While monasteries saw it as a gift of God, lords saw it as a parich source of income. The manorial system gave them the right to build and control mills on their estates, and the peasants, their tenants, were required to use them. This was called banal milling, from the ban, or lord's command. Every peasant who grew grain had to bring it to the lord's mill, paying a fee, usually 1/16 of the flour produced. If anyone tried to grind at home, perhaps with a secret quernstone, they risked fines or confiscation. In some places, a serf caught doing so might see his hand mill smashed, a symbolic act as much as a punishment. The lord, of course, gained not only flour, but authority. The mill stood as a visible reminder of feudal order, a place where labor met law. And yet, it was also a place of community. People gathered there to wait their turn, to gossip, to trade news, to flirt, to argue. The smell of flour and the sound of grinding were woven into the fabric of everyday life. A medieval proverb captured the miller's ambiguous role. No miller can ever be poor, nor wholly honest. For where there was grain, there was temptation. A few handfuls of flour skimmed from each sack, who would notice? The sound of the wheel might drown the whisper of theft, but everyone knew it happened. Still, the miller was tolerated, even respected. He understood the machinery of necessity. Without him, there would be no bread. Beyond England, mills spread across Europe in countless variations. In the flatlands of Flanders and the Low Countries, where rivers were sluggish, the windmill appeared a brilliant adaptation that caught not water, but air. The earliest known windmills date to the 12th century, their sails turning lazily over the marshes. By the 13th, they had become common across the continent, pumping water, grinding grain, and later, even sawing timber. The world was learning to harness nature, not to dominate it, but to collaborate with it. The medieval mill, in all its forms, was the first great expression of mechanical partnership between man and environment. And so, by the end of the 12th century, Europe was turning thousands of wheels creaking, splashing, humming. It was not yet an industrial revolution, but it was something subtler, a revolution of habit, a shift from muscle to mechanism, from human endurance to hydraulic rhythm. If you stood by a riverside village in the year 1200, you would have heard it, the roar of the mill race, the steady pulse of the wheel, the faint laughter of children carrying sacks of grain, a sound both ordinary and eternal, the heartbeat of medieval life. And yet, behind that comforting rhythm lay questions of ownership, power, and change. As mills multiplied, so too did disputes over rights to water, over tolls, over broken gears, and flooded fields. The wheel that brought prosperity could also stir resentment. By the dawn of the 13th century, the watermill had become not just a machine, but a metaphor, a symbol of turning fortune, of ceaseless motion, of labor transformed. It was progress measured in drops and turns, rather than leaps and explosions. But who were the men who tended these wheels day and night? Who lived by the rhythm of the stones? Whose hands smelled of flour and grease? Who kept the rivers turning through storm and drought alike? Their lives were not written in chronicles. They appear only in stray court records, in the margins of manorial accounts, or in the laughter of Chaucer's tales. Yet without them, the Middle Ages would have starved. To understand them is to understand the hidden machinery of history itself. To live as a miller in the Middle Ages was to exist at the intersection of human need and mechanical force. You were neither lord nor serf, yet your labor touched both. You were not a priest, yet people watched you as closely as they would a confessor, because what you controlled was essential. The transformation of grain into bread, the simplest and most vital of human necessities. The mill was your world. It smelled of flour and water, of damp wood and wet stone. The air was thick with fine dust, so that after a long day, the white powder coated your clothes, your hair, even your skin. And yet that dust was not merely residue, it was proof of purpose. It signaled work done, sustenance made, a village served. A miller's day began with the river. He had to ensure that the water flowed at just the right pace. Too strong, and the wheel could break. Too weak, and the grinding would stall. The mill race, the channel that carried water from the stream to the wheel, required constant attention. Silt had to be cleared, leaves and branches removed, small floods diverted. In winter, ice could jam the wheel. In summer, drought could slow it to a grinding halt. Even the smallest mechanical failure could have consequences for the whole village. Bread was the staple, and without flour, hunger followed. The miller was therefore both caretaker and guarantor, a silent steward of survival. The mill itself was not a quiet place. The constant grinding of stones produced a low, rumbling hum that echoed through the beams and over the water. Every rotation was measured, every adjustment critical. If the stones were too far apart, grain was crushed into coarse grits rather than fine flour. Too close, and the friction could cause heat, ruining the grain and damaging the mill. A good miller learned to listen to the mill, the pitch of the turning wheel, the sound of the grain feeding through the hopper, the subtle squeal of wooden gears. Each mill had its own personality, shaped by the flow of the river, the construction of the wheel, and the temperament of the miller. To work a mill efficiently was to understand it almost as a living thing, a partnership between human and nature. It was a solitary work in many ways, yet paradoxically, social in another. Villagers came to the mill several times a week to grind their grain, bringing with them news, gossip, and complaints. You learned about births, deaths, marriages, and quarrels before the priest or the reeve did. You were an informal recorder of the village's memory. People watched your hands and ears as closely as they watched your stones, knowing that a careless or dishonest miller could steal a portion of their flour. Dishonesty was always a temptation. A miller could skim a handful here, a sack there. In some manors, the miller's share, called the multure, was legally defined, a portion of each grain delivered as payment. In practice, the miller might take more. Medieval peasants hated the miller, yet they relied on him. A proverb of the time captured this uneasy relationship. A miller will steal corn, but not the heart of the village. Despite this wariness, the miller held a position of quiet influence. You had knowledge that the Lord did not. Knowledge that ordinary villagers trusted only you to interpret. The speed of the wheel, the proper care of grain, the timing of harvest, even the weather. A miller's judgment could mean the difference between bread and famine. Socially, millers were a peculiar caste. Technically free, yet often under the control of the manor, they could accumulate modest wealth. Many were landless, living above or beside the mill itself, earning their keep entirely through labor and tolls. Some married daughters of peasants or other tradespeople, creating families that were neither fully peasant nor entirely outside the manorial system. Their children would inherit not only their house, but also their knowledge, the language of water and stone, which could secure their survival in a precarious world. Mills were also hubs of innovation. A miller had to understand carpentry, mechanics, hydrodynamics, and sometimes even law. The water wheel, though simple in concept, required precise craftsmanship. Wooden gears had to mesh correctly, axles needed, greasing and occasional replacement. Millstones had to be dressed grooves carved in concentric circles to ensure proper grinding. A single error could damage the machinery or reduce efficiency. Occasionally, a miller might expand his work, constructing a small forge to repair tools, installing a simple saw mechanism, or even experimenting with early forms of mechanical automation. Some abbeys encouraged such ingenuity. The monks of St. Gall in Switzerland, for example, kept detailed technical records of water-powered mills, mapping the flow of rivers, the slope of channels, and the pitch of wheels. For a miller, knowledge was power, and skill was currency. Yet the mill was not without danger. One misstep, one splintered wheel, one overflowing river could destroy both livelihood and home. Children often helped, carrying grain sacks and keeping the fire stoked for the occasional grain drying, learning the rhythms of labor before they could read. Injuries were common. Crushed and fingers, falls into mill races, accidental burns from the friction of stone. Life was measured not only in wealth and influence, but in survival. The miller also bore witness to subtle social changes. Lords might grant additional milling rights, expand water channels, or enforce new tolls. Peasant families sometimes challenged the miller, claiming they had the right to grind at home. Disputes were taken to the manorial court, often with witnesses from the community. Here, the miller's position was both precarious and central. Your knowledge could protect you or condemn you. Your honesty could preserve peace or provoke outrage. Even festivals and markets revolved around the mill. Seasonal gatherings coincided with the milling of new grain, creating opportunities for trade and celebration. A skilled miller could become the hub of his community, a quiet pivot around which village life revolved. Milling was not merely a physical task. It was a form of communication. By observing water, levels, flow rates, and the operation of nearby mills, a miller could warn villages of impending floods or droughts. Your reports, often informal, were essential for planning, planting, and harvesting. In a world without newspapers or modern meteorology, this knowledge was invaluable. The miller's life was one of routine and rhythm, of repetition and variation. The seasons dictated activity, grinding harvested grain in late summer, repairing wheels in winter, clearing channels in spring. The day began with the first light, paused only for brief meals, and ended with the quiet hum of stones as evening fell. It was, in its own way, a meditation labor woven with reflection, observation, and survival. Water, stones, and grain were more than tools. They were the vectors of human persistence. Every loaf of bread, every sip of ale made from malted grain passed through the hands of a miller. Their work defined the calories, the nutrition, and the very survival of their communities. History rarely records them by name, yet the Middle Ages would have been unrecognizable without them. By the 13th century, the miller had become an essential figure, embedded in folklore, proverb, and local law. He was a professional, a tradesman, a necessary intermediary between nature, lord, and peasant. And through his labor, he quietly transformed the economic and social fabric of Europe. The miller's world, the slow turning of water wheels, the fine dust of stone, the rhythm of human and river alike, may seem mundane, even boring. And yet, it contains one of the oldest lessons of history, that civilization is built not only by kings and armies, but by quiet, persistent labor, by the patient conversion of natural energy into human sustenance.